Hello, Story Store listeners. If you guys like this story, please subscribe to Story Store and hit the bell icon. Thank you. The rain lashed against the small windows of the house as the mailman, Jack, pounded on the porch with the intensity of someone who had been out in the storm for far too long. His boots left muddy prints on the worn steps, and his breath came in rapid bursts as he fumbled with the drenched letters. The woman who answered the door looked up at him with sharp eyes, a mix of curiosity and impatience in her gaze. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice weary but resolute. She was a woman of middle age, her face lined with years of grief and solitude. Her name was Evelyn, though Jack had only ever known her as the widow who lived at the end of Maple Lane. He didn't know much more than that. It was none of his business, after all. I have something for you," Jack said, his hand trembling as he extended a single, pristine envelope. It was remarkably well preserved, despite the storm, and sealed with a wax stamp Evelyn hadn't seen in years. She froze, her eyes locking on the elegant script, her breath catching in her throat. "I didn't think anyone lived here anymore," Jack continued, his brow furrowing as he noticed her sudden shift. "I mean, I didn't know who else to give it to." Evelyn's hand shot out, taking the letter with a speed that startled even her. She didn't know why, but something deep within her heart was whispering that this wasn't just any letter. She hadn't seen this handwriting in decades, and as she slowly turned the envelope over, her pulse quickened at the familiar swirling signature. J. The letter was from him. Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway, her fingers gripping the letter as if it might vanish from her hands at any moment. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, a rhythmic sound that seemed to echo the pounding of the rain against the windows behind her. The letter, so simple in its appearance, was anything but. She could feel the weight of it, not just in the paper itself, but in the memories it had dragged up from the depths of her past. Her breath caught as she stared at the wax seal, the initials etched in the dark red stamp, J. The name was a ghost she had tried to bury for so many years. For a long moment she stood there, the world outside fading into a blur as time seemed to stretch and warp. The rain was relentless, but Evelyn hardly noticed the weather anymore. She had only one focus now, the letter in her hands. How? She thought, her mind struggling to keep up with the torrent of emotions coursing through her. She hadn't seen this handwriting in decades. She hadn't even thought of it in years, not consciously, anyway. And yet, as her fingers traced the elegant swirls of ink on the page, it was as though the years between then and now dissolved into nothing. The memories, sharp and unrelenting, came rushing back. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she was no longer standing in her small, quiet hallway. She was in the past, her mind drifting back to the summers of her youth, to the time when everything had seemed possible, when the world had been full of promise. It had been then, those long, golden days that James had walked into her life. His name was James, and he had been everything to her. They had met by chance, or perhaps it had been fate. Evelyn had been walking home from school one autumn afternoon when she had stumbled upon him, literally, on the narrow dirt road leading toward her house. He had been standing there, gazing at something in the distance, and she hadn't seen him until she had nearly collided with him. In the instant before she could apologize, his wide smile had disarmed her. "I'm sorry," she had said, her voice shaky, embarrassed by the sudden interruption. But he had laughed, a deep, rich sound that made her heart skip a beat. "No harm done," he had said, his eyes twinkling as they met hers. "I think it was fate." And that had been the start. From that moment they were inseparable. They spent days by the lake, talking about everything and nothing. They walked for miles, sharing dreams and secrets as the world drifted by. He had a way of making everything seem more colorful, more vibrant. With James, the mundane became magical, and Evelyn felt like she was walking on air every time they were together. She could still remember the first time he kissed her. It had been under the thick canopy of a towering oak tree, the leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The sun had been low, casting a warm glow on everything. He had turned to her, his hands gently cupping her face, and whispered her name before pressing his lips to hers. It had been sweet, tender, and full of promise. Like everything was going to be all right, like they were meant to be. But James wasn't just her first love. He was the kind of love that you only experience once in your life. He was the one that sets the standard for all others, the one you compare everyone else to, even when you know that no one could ever measure up. For months, everything had felt perfect, and then, just like that, it wasn't. The day James left, Evelyn had woken to find an empty space beside her in bed, a note on the pillow where he had slept. She had read it over and over, unable to comprehend the words at first. He had written that he was sorry, that he couldn't explain, that he needed to leave. He promised he would write, but the letters never came. Not a single word from him after that day. She had waited. She had waited for weeks, for months. She had asked around, searched the town, even gone to his parents' house, but no one knew where he had gone or why he had left. His family had been as confused as she was. James had vanished from her life without a trace, leaving only the unanswered question of why. The pain of his sudden disappearance had been too much to bear. It had cut through her like a knife, and she had cried for days, unable to stop herself. She couldn't understand why he had left or what she had done wrong. But as time went on, the pain faded, and life continued. She had tried to move on. She had to, after all. The world didn't stop just because her heart had been broken. She had found solace in the arms of someone else, a man named Henry, who had been patient with her, who had loved her when she didn't think she could love anyone else. They had married and had children, and though Henry's love was deep and steady, it had never been the love that James had given her. But that was the way of the world, wasn't it? You could never go back, never turn time backward to reclaim what was lost. Still, she had never forgotten James. He had lingered in the back of her mind, a shadow that never truly left. She had buried him deep in her heart, locking away the memories and pretending she was okay. She had told herself that he was just a chapter in her past, one that would eventually fade, replaced by the life she had built with Henry. But now, as she stood in her hallway, staring down at the letter that had appeared out of nowhere, she realized that some things don't fade, some loves don't die, and some questions never get answered. She sat down at the kitchen table, her fingers still lightly touching the letter. The paper felt smooth and fragile, as though it had been touched by time itself. She held it up to the light, scanning the familiar handwriting once more. She had memorized it years ago, the looping, elegant letters that spoke of love and longing. The handwriting had been James' signature, his mark on her life, his way of saying he was there, that he cared. The letter spoke of regret, of a love that had never been forgotten. It was full of the same tenderness that had defined their relationship all those years ago. But the question was, why now? Why had James written to her after all this time? What had happened to him? Why had he disappeared without a trace? Evelyn's mind raced, her heart torn between anger and longing, hope and sorrow. The years had changed her. She was no longer the young girl who had been swept away by James's love, no longer the woman who had waited in vain for him to return. She had lived a life without him, And yet there was a part of her, a deep, buried part, that had never stopped loving him. Tears welled up in her eyes as she placed the letter back on the table. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do with it. How could she even begin to process what it meant? How could she open a door to the past that had been sealed shut for so long? For the first time in years, Evelyn found herself uncertain, adrift in the sea of memories and unanswered questions. The letter had reopened a wound that had never fully healed, and now she was left to confront the remnants of a love she thought she had lost forever. Evelyn placed the letter on the kitchen table and sat down, her fingers hovering over it. Her mind swirled with memories of James, the way his laugh had filled the air, the way he had kissed her on the edge of the riverbank, as if the world was theirs to conquer. But then, the silence. He had vanished from her life without a word. For years she had searched for answers. She had contacted mutual friends, visited his family's house, and even hired a private investigator. But each inquiry returned the same results. James had disappeared, leaving no trace behind. In the aftermath, Evelyn had tried to move on. She had married another man, a good man named Henry, who had loved her in a way James never could. Henry had been dependable and steady. They had children together, but there was always a part of her that remained frozen in the past, in that summer when everything had seemed perfect. Now, sitting at the table, Evelyn thought of the years she had spent wondering what happened. Where was he? What happened to him? The letter was here, though. It felt like an answer. But was it the answer she had been hoping for? With a trembling hand, Evelyn slowly unsealed the envelope, her fingers brushing against the cool wax. She unfolded the note, the familiar scent of aged paper filling her nostrils. As her eyes traced the words, her heart began to race. Evelyn, my love, I never wanted to leave. I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you the truth, but I fear it's too late. Please forgive me, and know that my love for you has never died. The words felt like a betrayal and a balm at the same time. How could he have written this? How could he have sent it after all these years? Was it too late? Did it even matter? Evelyn's thoughts collided with her emotions as she read and reread the words. She remembered James' promises of always being by her side, his insistence that nothing could tear them apart. But then he was gone, and she was left alone, piecing together a life that no longer made sense without him. Why now? She wondered. Why after all this time? Evelyn's heart ached as the memories surged back. She had never stopped loving James, even after all these years. But when he had disappeared, she had been forced to move on. She couldn't wait forever. She had to survive, had to live. She had married Henry, who had given her stability and love, though it was not the same kind of love James had given her. And yet she had never let go. The absence of James had haunted her, a shadow that lingered in every corner of her life. The letter was like a dream, something too surreal to be real. What did it mean? Could she trust it? Could she allow herself to open the door to the past she had carefully shut away? The house grew quiet around her as she sat in the stillness, grappling with a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. For years, she had told herself that James was gone, that it was over, but now, this letter. The silence stretched long into the night. Evelyn's decision gnawed at her for days. She didn't tell anyone about the letter, not even Henry. She didn't know what to say, how to explain it. Instead, she drove herself to the edge of the life she had built. She went to the riverbank where James had kissed her for the last time, the place where they had promised eternal love. The rain had stopped and the sky was clear, but the air felt thick with something unspeakable. She sat there, letting the memories wash over her like the slow-moving water in front of her. It was here, in the place they had shared, that she finally understood the weight of what the letter meant. The truth was, she had never truly let go of James. He had always been there, tucked away in a corner of her heart, waiting for the right moment to return. She closed her eyes and imagined him standing beside her, his voice soft against the wind. "I never wanted to leave, Evelyn. I love you." It wasn't just the letter. It was the realization that she had never truly moved on. The letter was a catalyst, but it had not been the end of her journey. Evelyn knew she had a choice to make. She could live in the past, clinging to a love that had long ago faded into memories, or she could continue forward, honoring the life she had built with Henry. Both paths felt impossible to walk. Henry had been her rock, the man who had loved her with everything he had. He had been patient, kind, and steady. But now, with James' words echoing in her heart, Evelyn was torn. She had spent years wondering what had happened to James, what had kept him away, and now that she had an answer, it didn't feel like the closure she had imagined. She went back home, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The night was quiet again, and the weight of the letter seemed to settle around her like an unseen presence. In the end, Evelyn chose to keep the letter. She didn't share it with Henry, didn't try to explain the past she had so carefully tucked away. But she could never forget it. The letter, the memories, and the love that had never fully died, it all remained a part of her, woven into the fabric of her life. Years passed, and the storm that had once raged inside her quieted. But Evelyn never truly let go of the letter, nor did she ever forget James. It had become a part of her, a bittersweet relic from a time when love had meant everything. And though she had chosen to move forward, she had found peace, knowing that some loves, no matter how lost or long gone, never truly fade.